Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sonia Purnell. Good evening, everyone. My name is Julia Ray Hadenfield from New Canaan Library, and I'm so pleased to welcome Sonia Purnell, author of best-selling book, A Woman of No Importance, the untold story of the American spy who helped win World War II. Tonight, Ms. Purnell will discuss the remarkable story of Virginia Hall, an unrecognized but highly impactful World War II heroine who established intricate spy networks throughout France and became vital to the resistance. Ms. Purnell will discuss her book, the research that went into it, and the historic events that surround this incredible story. You can grab a copy of A Woman of No Importance either at the library or pick up a copy at Elm Street Books. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Sonia Purnell. Thanks so much for being with us tonight, Sonia.
Well, very much. Thank you for inviting me to join you all. I'm talking to you from London, and it's a real great pleasure. I wish I was with you all in person, but this is obviously the next best thing, and it's a really great opportunity. Thank you for talking about Virginia, which is something I very much like doing, by the way. So A Woman of No Importance, people ask me, well, why did you call a book that? Well, obviously there's a bit of a tribute there to Oscar Wilde and his book, A Woman of No Importance. But it's also about Virginia because, you know, before the war and after the war, that's very much how she was treated. Not well, not really with respect, but during the war, those 5 or 6 years of the war, there were lots of things that sort of paradoxical about her life. But, you know, war really did give her personal peace. She suffered this terrible accident, lost her leg, but finally she found a way to do things that were great and helpful and heroic, actually, but to be someone, the person that she wanted to be, the person who could do great things, those things that she prevented from doing for the rest of her life. And one of the things that really amazed me writing this book and researching it was that, you know, I used to think, and a lot of people think this, yeah, well, the Second World War, surely we know everything there is to know about it. But what really struck me as I researched the story is that we really don't. And here was one of those stories about a woman. Yes, a lot of the women's stories from the Second World War haven't been told yet, but this woman was really exceptional, an exceptional person. What she did would have been equally exceptional for a man. But the fact that she was a disabled woman, a woman without a leg, what she did was phenomenal. But I can also tell you that as she was a secret agent, she was never going to make it easy to find out her story. And I think that's probably a very good reason why the full story hadn't come out before. And I ended up spending 3.5 years, lots of 100-hour weeks, missing birthdays and holidays and weekends away and things to try and follow her trail. And there were lots of dark alleys. There were moments when I thought, days, weeks even, when I thought I'm never going to get to the bottom of this story. But I had great maps up on the wall at home, and I was trying to work out all her different missions and code names and little bits of string and stickers and trying to work it out. And fortunately, very fortunately, I had 3 great pieces of luck, because I don't think I could have done it otherwise. 2 of those pieces of luck were meeting former intelligence officers on both sides of the Atlantic. So here in Britain, completely by accident, by the way, doesn't life throw up these strange moments? And then he introduced me to someone who had worked for the CIA, who was equally helpful. So those were 2 great moments. And the third moment was when I was researching in the Resistance Museum in Lyon, in southeast France, her sort of headquarters city. An extraordinary museum. It's the old Gestapo headquarters. And I can tell you that when you go in there, you kind of have a shiver. It doesn't have good vibes, this building, in any way. Up on the top floor, though, is a library, a really superb library on the resistance, many books, many files and things. And I was absolutely gobsmacked by what I found there, which was a trolley covered in a good inch of dust of files put together, letters, other files, photographs, photocopies, put together by someone that she had, a Frenchman that had fought alongside, had actually been quite obstructive at times until he realized better, but someone who'd fought alongside her in the war and had collected testimony and letters from people before they died, but also documents before they were destroyed or lost. Because what was so frustrating so often was that something like 85% of the papers relating to the intelligence agency she worked with here in Britain had been lost or destroyed. About 75% were burnt in a fire in France, and many files that were supposed to be in the National Archives in Maryland weren't there. They were either lost or misfiled or simply disappeared. It often felt like Virginia and I were playing slight cat and mouse, from the grave. But I think in the end, I got there, and I am so pleased I did. So who was this extraordinary woman? If we could look at the next slide, please, that would be great. So this is where she grew up, just outside Baltimore, rather lovely farmhouse, rather genteel looking and spacious, wonderful, but it didn't have central heating, and it had to pump in water from a family better off. In previous generations, they'd lost quite a lot of the fortune, and now the apartment in Baltimore was only rented, whereas that the house that the family had in Baltimore before apparently had a hallway so wide that you could turn around a carriage and horses. But now the whole family, comparatively speaking, were on slightly hard times. And so Virginia's mother, Mrs. Barbara Hall, who was her father's secretary, had married her boss and was quite socially ambitious, I think it's fair to say, was very, very keen for Virginia to marry money, to restore the family fortune, to marry someone with a fashionable household, bring up some well-groomed, well-educated kids, and to settle obediently down at home as a good wife. A great plan. She wasn't the first nor the last mother to have this plan for her daughter, but there was a problem with it. And the problem was Virginia. If we could look at the next slide, please. Now, as you can see here, there's something of the tomboy about Virginia. So she really wasn't the sort to sit obediently at home with a husband who called the shots. She liked doing sort of boy things. She liked going off into the forest with her dad, going hunting, bareback riding on horses, loved animals, loved being with animals, really was an adventurous spirit. Didn't want to be contained. Let me give you an example. I mean, she once went into high school wearing a bracelet made out of live snakes. Well, this highly amused her classmates and made them realize at an early age she wasn't quite like everybody else. She was a bit different. She just had this spark of adventure in her. There was something also, a leadership quality in her, an integrity. She could be a little bossy at times, but people didn't mind because there was something about her that made you want to follow her. And a lot of her classmates realized that she was just that bit special. The next slide, please. So unfortunately, I don't have a picture of the snake bracelet for you, but here I have a picture of a bird hat. She did have this way with animals. Here she's, all these birds are collecting around her, and she liked dressing up and being fun. And it's interesting because her mother always said to her that whatever you learn as a child will eventually come in useful. And you know that sort of love of dressing up, that love of animals would indeed come in very useful, but not in a way that anyone could possibly imagine at this point. Anyway, she was very close to her father, Ned, who rather indulged his daughter in a way that her mother didn't so much. And when she said, I really want to go abroad and study, I don't want to get married, you know, I want to be an ambassador. No women had been an ambassador at that point for America, but she didn't want that to stop her. So she wanted to go abroad, learn languages, train to be an ambassador, join the State Department once she finished studying. And her father eventually agreed. So if we look at the next slide, please. Here she is. So she packs off to France in the 1920s, when she's 20 years old. And it wasn't like getting on a American Airlines flight now, where you'd be there a few hours later. She, at just 20, got the liner across the Atlantic to Paris to study. Now, this was quite a different world from the one that she'd left behind in Baltimore. France had no racial segregation. There was no prohibition. So Paris was deeply exciting. She went to jazz cafes. She met musicians and writers and poets and racing drivers and politicians. And it was absolutely fascinating for her. It was a liberation for her. That's how she felt. She saw les garçons, the young women who dressed like men and had lifestyle like men, the same kind of freedom, the same emancipation. Look here how she's cut her hair short, very, very voguish at the time. This is what she wanted. She wanted to study and to see the world. And she fell in love with Paris, and many of us do, and she certainly did at that point. It was a love that would never die, actually. She never forgot those happy, happy years in Paris in her 20s and in the 1920s, les années folles, very exciting and fun after the horrors of the First World War. But unfortunately, more horrors were to come. And it wasn't long before she realized that. She moved from Paris to Vienna to study at the Consular Academy, to study diplomacy and the press. And she saw there in Vienna fascist mobs running through the streets, really unhindered, uncontrolled. Over the border in Germany, started to hear about Hitler, the rise of Nazism. Over the other border in Italy, Mussolini was already in power. It was already becoming a one-party state, a police state, a totalitarian state. Extremism, both on the right wing and the left wing, much further away in Russia, of course, was stalking Europe. And she saw it and realized that this was a really huge event, and that it didn't just affect Europe, it would eventually affect her own country. This made her want to become an ambassador even more, to alert her country to what was happening, and in some way alert the world, help the world to prevent disaster as she saw it. Well, the Wall Street crash happened in 1929. As we know, she came back to America shortly after that. And I'm afraid Ned, her beloved dad, she called him Ned, walked out of his office one day knowing that his company, his corporation, was in deep trouble. And he collapsed on the sidewalk and died. This was a terrible, terrible blow for Virginia. But it made her want to work even more. The family coffers were now pretty empty. And so she applied to the State Department, thinking, by this point, I speak 5 languages. I have studied widely in Europe. I'm very in tune with what's going on politically and socially in Europe. Surely I'll be useful to the State Department. Well, unfortunately, they didn't see it quite the same way. And perhaps she should realize was at the time there were only 6 women diplomats at any level in the entire United States, and she was turned down as a diplomat. However, Virginia never took no. She didn't take no this time either. She decided that she would join the State Department as a clerk, a secretary, much more lowly than she'd hoped, particularly after all the qualifications that she'd acquired by this point. But at least she was going to be in the Foreign Service. She was going to be posted abroad, and she was, to Turkey. And this was an extraordinary event for her. It meant that she could continue hunting, which she so loved doing. Her father had left her his own hunting rifle. And so one day when she was in Turkey, she went off hunting with friends. It was a December day, beautiful, sunny, mild day in the Gediz Delta marshes, and she was shooting snipe, and they have a very erratic pattern of flight, difficult to shoot. She was very competitive, concentrating on getting her first snipe. Presumably that's why she didn't notice that there was a wire fence running through the reeds of the marshes. So as she ran with her gun, she stumbled over the wire fence. She grabbed her gun as she fell. She had not engaged the safety catch. And she shot herself, literally shot herself in the foot, left foot, at point blank range. To cut a long and dramatic story short, she nearly died several times. The only possible way of saving her, she was now 27, was to cut off her left leg, fortunately below the knee, but even then they thought they'd lost her because she became very ill indeed. But somehow she pulled through. If we could see the next slide, please. And here is a picture of her just before her accident. Look at that face, by the way. It's innocent, it's idealist, it's determined, but there's very much a young woman, an ingenue, if you like, on the world. This is a cutting from the Baltimore Sun about her accident. It was quite big news in Baltimore. She came back with her stump, with a very, very primitive, almost like a piece of wood, as her prosthetic leg. They gave her a slightly better one in the States, where she spent several months recovering. But I can tell you that in the 1930s, where we are now, the prosthetics were extremely primitive still, and for the rest of her life she would be in constant pain. It never ever left her. And the heavy, quite heavy leg, which she called Cuthbert, by the way, wood, painted flesh color, but with a metal heel, which just handily had a little slot in it. No one would expect that, but it did. And it was held on by leather straps around her waist and down her leg. And when it was hot, they would chafe her skin so much it would bleed. And her stump, despite special socks and all sorts of things, they didn't have silicone like they have now, bled too. So although she was determined to get around and to resume her career, it was not without huge personal cost. And I think it's fair to say that the State Department probably didn't want her back at this point. They probably thought she was too much trouble. So they posted her somewhere that really couldn't have been worse for a new amputee, one with a prosthetic leg where the ankle doesn't flex or extend. They posted her to Venice. Now, if you think about it, there are no cars, obviously, but there are 400 little bridges that go up and go down over the canals. They gave her a job which would entail going up and down those bridges very often, pretty much all day. The pain was intense, but she was determined to get through it, and she was determined to take the State Department exams, the Foreign Service exams again, by the way. So to make sure that she did her job absolutely brilliantly, she came up with a solution. Again, this is a clue to Virginia's character, the extraordinary sort of force of character she had. She wasn't going to be put off by all those bridges. She would come up with a solution. She came up with an ingenious solution, which was, next slide, please, a gondola. She bought a gondola, and here's Angelo, her friend, a Venetian friend, teaching her how to use it. Now, amazingly, the water in the canals in Venice does get quite rough sometimes, and it's hard enough with two good legs. She had one bad leg, one wooden leg, and she was still doing this. And so sometimes he would come with her and be ready to catch her if it felt like she was going to fall in the water. But this just shows you the extraordinary determination that Virginia had, and which her bosses in Venice very much appreciated, by the way. They gave her all sorts of duties that a mere desk clerk would not normally be asked to do. In fact, she stood in for proper career diplomats when they were away for any reason. They realized they had an absolutely a real gem. So they encouraged her to take the exams again to join the diplomatic service. She did. She passed. And then she was told that Cordell Hull himself, the Secretary of State quoted an obscure rule that no amputees could join the diplomatic service. Well, that's a bit bizarre, because on one occasion I gave a lecture much like this in Boston, and a young gentleman came up to me and told me that his grandfather, who had lost a leg in the First World War, had joined the State Department office about that time, and no one said a thing about the fact that he had lost a leg. So I think we know what's going on here. She certainly knew what was going on here. Some family friends complained to FDR himself, who asked Cordell Hull, who dismissed her as a woman of no importance, and rather ironically, considering FDR's own disability, decided to take it no further. In the end, she resigned from the State Department. I think her heart was broken. War was coming. She thought she was wasting her time answering the telephone. In fact, after she'd appealed like that, she was, if anything, demoted and sent to Tallinn in Estonia, where she really had very meager duties, although occasionally she would be sending secret reports about what was happening in a country very close, obviously, to the Russian border. And I think that was her first taste of the secret world, and I suspect she rather liked it. Anyway, war breaks out in September 1939. She goes to London, she volunteers her services, and I'm ashamed to say that they couldn't see any reason to employ Miss Virginia Hall. She was disabled, she was a woman, she was a foreigner. The Brits at the time thought they could do it by themselves. Well, she went to work for the American embassy as a typist in London, and waiting to be repatriated to Baltimore. Her mother was very keen for her to come back, but then she had another idea. She would go to France, and she volunteered for the ambulance service, because they didn't care whether you were a foreigner or a woman, and she could drive an ambulance. She could still drive very well. They didn't care. They needed people. So in May 1940, she drove up to Metz, near the Maginot Line, the supposedly impregnable Maginot Line, to drive ambulances. A few days later, the Germans poorly invaded France. They overran it. It was mayhem. The Maginot Line didn't last more than 5 minutes. She was suddenly driving her ambulance to and fro from the battlefield, picking up the wounded, being dive bombed by Stukas, under machine gun fire. All the time, this exodus of people fleeing the Germans, she would be driving her ambulance towards danger again and again and again, even after many others had given up. Her courage, tenacity was extraordinary. In the end, France capitulated. As we know, she was demobilized. Did she go home to Baltimore? No, she did not. You're probably realizing that wouldn't be Virginia. What she saw was a chance to prove that her life hadn't ended when she lost her leg. Her father had appeared to her in a dream and said, "You must go on living." So she felt like she'd been saved for some kind of reason. And so she went to London again, but on her way, because it wasn't easy, France was now under the Nazi heel. She had to go through an occupied country on her own, down to Spain, over to Portugal, and then catch a liner back up to London. A really treacherous journey for a woman on her own, just extraordinary. But she was determined to do it. And on the way, there was a 1 in a billion chance happened. She was in a railway station in Spain, trying to make her way further down into Spain and into Portugal. And an undercover British agent noticed a striking young woman insisting on buying a train ticket, who'd just crossed the border from France. And he got talking to her, and she told him all the things that she'd seen in France. And he was incredibly impressed at her presence of mind, her observation, her courage, and her determination to do something else for the war effort. Even though, remember, America is not in the war yet. This is a long time before Pearl Harbor. So he does the most important thing he ever does in his life, and he gives her a piece of paper with a phone number on it, and he says it's a friend. But when she got to London, she soon realizes that that friend was in fact a member of a new secret service set up by Churchill, a secret service that would conduct ungentlemanly warfare, would go into occupied France, not in uniform, but undercover, would not only spy, but also blow things up and eventually fight. Now, this was a brilliant idea, sure, but no one was prepared to do it. There was no backup. There was no way of communicating initially with Britain. No one had ever done anything like this before. People said, are you crazy? Why would I do that? And then Virginia comes into view and she says, I'll do it. I'll go undercover as an American journalist. I'll go in and I'll do it. And she did. So September 1941, which is where we are now, she goes into occupied France on her own. No contacts or no reliable contacts. Very little training because no one quite knew what she would meet or how she would do it. All they wanted her at that point was to try and help kickstart the resistance by helping create networks and things, but they actually didn't really think that she would survive. Basically untrained, disabled desk clerk from Baltimore going into occupied France or wartime France. Why would you think that she would survive? But the extraordinary thing is she not only survived, she went on to do some of the most heroic work of anyone in the war. She did indeed help kickstart the French resistance. She recruited hundreds, if not thousands, into secret networks. She established communication networks so that she could make contact again with London. She did all sorts of incredible things. If we go on to the next slide, please, now. Look at that face now. This is wartime Virginia. Look at that determination. You wouldn't take her on lightly, would you? She really was an incredibly focused, determined, brave woman. She was going to prove herself. And she did again and again and again. So not only did she set up these networks, but she started to prepare people for the eventual return. She gave them hope. People thought Britain would capitulate, that there would be no, the Americans would never come. What was the point of going on fighting, putting your entire family in danger? She persuaded them. Remember that leadership, that special character that people had noticed at school. She persuaded them, yes, it was not only important, but vital that people went on fighting, that there was something in them to keep them going, that the Brits and the Americans would eventually come back. How she made them so confident, we will never know, but she did. And she also had this extremely developed sixth sense, maybe from the isolation that such an accident gives you, of working out who would be trustworthy. I mean, she went up and risked her life several times a day recruiting people. Any of them could have gone to the Gestapo and betrayed her, but they didn't. And soon she had police chiefs working for her, staff in town halls, railway workers, doctors, prostitutes, pretty much anyone that you can think of. She recruited, she trained, she put them in sort of discrete cells that they didn't all know about each other to try and keep security as tight as possible. Obviously, very, very important. So the next slide, please. Oh, that was the bracelet, by the way, SSA, Service de Santé des Armées, so the sort of the health corps, if you like, of the French army. That's at the Spy Museum in DC, who have a few of her artifacts. Really worth going to have a look. They now have her, well, they have her radio and all sorts of things. The next slide, please. So what else was she brilliant at? Why was she so important? So she was one of the first agents to go in. There were two others at that time. By the time she went in, two Frenchmen. She was the first woman, the only woman for a very long time. But other agents came in and joined those two Frenchmen, and then they all got caught in a trap in Marseille. Some sixth sense thing again told her not to go, not to join them. They should never have all joined or met up, by the way. It was against all basic security, but they did, and they got caught, and they were being ready to be executed. She had to get them out. And we've all seen The Great Escape. We've all seen, you know, how a lot of them escaped, but then they were rounded up and they didn't make it. we've seen that film. It's shown here on British TV pretty much every Christmas. I can tell you that Virginia's genius and resourcefulness meant that she got 12 men out of this camp here. First of all, she managed through her contacts to get them moved out of a stone prison, absolutely no chance of getting them out there, to this camp here. And then she set about creating an absolutely brilliant plan, not only to communicate with the 12 agents inside, but to get them out. Now, if you haven't already read the book, I'm not going to tell you how she did it because it was very clever and I'd love you to find out. But I can tell you that she got all of them out safely, all of them over the mountains into Spain safely, and all back to Britain safely. Every single one. Now, the secret documents I found described this amazing act with using the word stupefaction. It was described as, the most extraordinary prison break of the war. And yet we don't know about it, or didn't know about it. Let's have a look at the next slide. Here are the 12 guys she got out, all secret agents, all able to go back eventually into France. I'm afraid not all of them survived their second mission, but at least they were there and they were able to play their role. And the secret documents say that many of our men, SOE, Special Operations Executive, that Churchill intelligence agency he set up, owe their lives to Virginia Hall. It's extraordinary that we haven't heard about her. What else did she do? The next slide, please. Well, I told you she recruited all sorts of people to her networks, preparing the networks are what important at this point, preparing for the eventual day when the Allies would come and help France expel the enemy. But in the meantime, it was about bringing in arms, sending out intelligence, getting all the people ready, safe houses, setting up wireless operators, bringing in parachute drops of arms and explosives and ammunition. You needed all sorts of different people. Here are two brothers, you can see, entertainers in civilian life before the war. She realized that they were good, and they were very good, and that extremely brave men who were eventually, I'm afraid, caught but survived the war, although only just. The next slide, please. Dennis Rake, one of my favorite characters of her story, extraordinary, looks like a sort of old-fashioned grocer, confessed to being terrified of loud noises and guns, but was described as the most coldly courageous man he'd ever met by his boss. So although he was scared, he conquered that fear. And again, he worked with Virginia very closely, and he described her as the greatest agent of the war. At the end of the war, by the way, no one would employ him because these agents wouldn't say what they'd done. They were very tight-lipped. He was almost destitute when Douglas Fairbanks Jr. recruited him as his butler. He had no idea what he'd done either. He had no idea he'd even fought in the war until he saw a letter to him mentioning one of his medals. Extraordinary man, Dennis Rake. The next one, please. Marcel Lecher, an idealist, wonderful young Frenchman, again, superbly brave, again, devoted to Virginia, called him his aunt, although she was only a few years older than him. I'm afraid he was also caught, and I'm afraid he lost his life in one of the concentration camps, but he did anything for her, and he was a superbly brave young man. The next one, please. Now, unfortunately, she became so successful, the prison break, the networks, minor acts of sabotage now, that the Germans realized that they had someone extraordinary in their midst who was running rings around them, being in the field month after month, now going into years without being caught. They knew there was a man, or they thought there was a man doing this, and then they realized it was a woman. And as their intelligence got better and better, they realized it was the limping lady. Was whatever Virginia did, she couldn't quite disguise her limp. And they dispatched this man to track her down and get closer to her. And he was a priest. And through extraordinary cunning and evil, I won't describe to you how he did it, but he got closer and closer to Virginia, to the point that they met. He even knew where her network headquarters were. And it was just as they were going to pounce, he was working for the Abwehr, German military intelligence, and the Gestapo, that she finally escaped. London had been calling her back again and again and again. It's getting too dangerous. They know who you are. Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo chief in Lyon, screaming in his headquarters, he'd give anything to get his hands on Virginia Hall. This man was dispatched. There was no double agent more cunning and evil than he, and he's dispatched to catch her. So finally she does have to escape, and she escapes over the Pyrenees in some of the worst snow for 200 years. The Gestapo on her trail with Cuthbert falling apart, the rivets are coming undone. Somehow, some extraordinary inner strength meant she made it over the mountains. Many able-bodied young men didn't do exactly the same path as she did. Somehow she did it. The next slide, please. She made it back to London. The Brits now say, she says, I'm going back to France. The Brits say, no, you're not. The Gestapo know what you look like. They know that you limp. They know your name. They know everything about you, thanks to that priest, Marcel Lecher. You can't go back. So what does she do? She goes to work for the Americans instead. Now they set up the Office of Strategic Services, a bit like an American equivalent of the SOE. And they don't really have anyone who's got the kind of field experience that she has. There isn't anyone. There aren't other Americans with that kind of field experience. So she walks in and says, I'll go in for you. Now, we know that the Gestapo know what she looks like, so she can't just go in as Virginia Hall. So she goes in dressed as a French peasant. Remember I said that her mother said everything that you learn now will one day be helpful. And indeed it was. So here are the animals that she'd played with on her farm as a child, and now she would know how to look after sheep and goats and cows and things. And she also got a Hollywood makeup artist to teach her how to draw wrinkles on her face so that she would look about 30 years older than she was. She had her teeth, her lovely white American teeth, ground down so that she looked like a French peasant. She dyed her hair. She wore several layers of clothing to make her look more stout, and to help her sort of shuffle so that she could hide her limp. Next slide, please. So with nothing more to protect her except that disguise, she became a partisan leader. Here is one of her people up in the Haute-Loire, where she went after a couple of places in the center of France. This is further south again, where there is a resistance, but they're fighting with kitchen knives and broom handles. So she calls in 22 parachute drops of arms and ammunition, vitamins, Benzedrine, drugs to keep them going at night. Sleep was a luxury. This is what they did. They didn't do their hearts much good, but that was the price they were prepared to pay. She became an extraordinary guerrilla leader using a handbook on what to do. Never had any training. Next slide, please. So here now she's also recruiting. She really is the most brilliant person at recruiting people. This is Gabriel. He was 17 years old, an orphan when she recruited him. He was devoted to her. After the war, he wrote letters saying that it'd been worth being born just to have met and fought alongside Virginia Hall. And so she formed this ragbag army of schoolboys, booksellers, farmers, vets, all sorts of different people, untrained, but organized them, disciplined them, trained them as much as she could, and then armed them. The next slide, please. And now this is after D-Day, but the Allied troops, the Americans, the Brits, the Canadians are all still stuck in Normandy, and the Germans are making incursions into this part of France and killing dozens of civilians. They had to move quickly. And so what did she do? She trained them with her handbook to do what you see here. So not only do you first of all line dynamite along a bridge and blow a breach in it, you then hijack a train and drive the train into the bridge to maximize the damage. In this way, with her ragbag army of schoolboys and vets and farmers, she eventually is able to, with their help, isolate an entire German garrison in Le Puy and liberate an entire department of France, 300 miles away or more from Normandy, without the help of a single professional soldier. Well, you can imagine that people got very excited about this. And there were lots of signals between senior officers that I found talking about this very courageous woman doing fine work, although sometimes they simply couldn't believe that she was a woman and referred to her as he. I think it was something that simply hadn't happened before. So not only did she do that, she cut phone lines, she got roads, she organized ambushes of convoys. There were a lot of willing people, men, to do this work, but often it was difficult, especially initially, to get them to take her orders. After all, she was a foreign woman from who knows where. She wasn't prepared to say French. She spoke French, with a very heavy American accent. It was a very conservative society where women hadn't had positions of authority. They couldn't even vote in France, way behind America in that aspect. And yet gradually, or really quite quickly, she persuaded them to take her orders. She had to be pretty tough about it. She organized parachute drops of money. She said, you need the money to pay your men, get them food. You need uniform, you need shoes. A lot of them didn't have shoes. You need food. A lot of them are starving. You need guns, ammunition, explosives. I can give you all of those things. You have to take my orders and work with the overall Allied strategy. Don't go just off and do your own thing. We have to work with the Allies generally. Meanwhile, she's also still sending back intelligence to Allied HQ, some of which is so useful that the American army has subsequently said that her intelligence was, quote, vital in the liberation of Paris. So not only was she in very large part responsible for helping to liberate an entire department of France without a professional army, the Allied professional armies were in very large part able to liberate Paris in the way that they did and with the speed that they did because of the intelligence that she sent, because she's also by this point a radio operator. So this is why when people ask, well, why was she important? I'm skating over this very quickly, but just to give you a few flavors of what she did, it was extraordinary. The next slide, please. Now, as I said, they cleared the Germans out of the Haute-Loire, the department that she'd been given responsibility for. And she sought permission afterwards, could she form a Commando Force to go looking for Germans wherever they might be. The war was rolling along quite quickly now through France, but that's what she wanted to do. And they commandeered this chateau. And here are some of those young boys that she recruited. There she is in the middle, the commanding officer. These boys, some of them were men, but some of them were certainly boys, would do anything that she asked them to do. So they commandeered this chateau. And one of the men with her on that balcony was called Paul, and he had been parachuted in quite recently. She'd long been asking for help, for backup from Allied HQ. It never came, even though she was a single woman commanding 400 or 500 men, rough, often desperate, starving. There are scars on the back of her head by now. We will never know how she got them. She never let on, but I suspect this was a very, very, very life indeed for a woman. As I say, she'd never got that back up until really once the fighting had stopped. And then Paul was one of two American officers who were parachuted in to help her. He was actually French by origin. He'd gone living in the States in his teens when his mother died, and he didn't have American citizenship at this point. But what he did have was a great sense of humor. He was incredibly loyal to her from the start, and he made her laugh. it was a long time since she'd laughed. And now here was this man who was charming and funny and devoted and took her orders without question, and was also, very luckily, a brilliant cook. Well, that night, the night that you can see here, they went to the lake in the grounds of the chateau, and they found an old boat and they went rowing. And that was when everything began for the two of them. And there was a poignant moment, actually, because shortly after that, they were told by the nearest Allied HQ that there was no point in them continuing. The war had rolled away from them. It wasn't for the resistance anymore, it was for professional armies. Their job was done, in effect. And she had to disband these men. And it was a very, very emotional moment. And the way that they write about it in the letters that I found is deeply moving, actually. I think they were very upset. I think they really wanted to go on fighting with her, but most of them went and joined the French regular army at this point. And she was wondering what to do with herself. She was actually chosen not long after this, out of all the special agents in Europe, across Europe, male and few women, all of them, for one of the most unbelievably dangerous missions of all, going into Austria, to where they thought Hitler had a sort of lair, hidden fortress in the Alps, where it was thought that he might hold out with a crack regiment of troops for another 2 years, prolong the war. And someone had to go in and find out whether this was true or just a figment of people's imagination, or even perhaps sort of propaganda put out by the Nazis. And she was chosen after all that she had done, because no one could think of anyone better, despite Cuthbert, despite it meaning she would have to climb over more mountain passes to perform this mission. And it was only because the Allies advanced more quickly than they expected that it never took place. But I think that gives you an impression of just how impressive she had been to her senior officers at this point, and how, therefore, how extraordinary it was that she disappeared. Next slide, please. Now, she was so exceptional that it was decided that she would be the only civilian woman in World War II to be awarded the Distinguished Service Order, and the Distinguished Service Cross. And Truman, FDR has died by now, obviously. President Truman himself wanted to give it to her in the Oval Office to mark what an extraordinary moment this was. And I think he must have been deeply surprised when he got the reply back from Virginia saying, "Thank you, Mr. President, but no thank you, Mr. President. You see, I want to go on being a secret agent after the war, and it wouldn't be good to have publicity because I want to keep busy." So instead, she was given her medal by Wild Bill Donovan, the rather charismatic head of the OSS, in his office just before the OSS was disbanded. The only witness was her mother. Paul didn't come, even though he came back to the States with her, because her mother didn't approve of him. He came from a very humble background. He wasn't at all the sort of man that Barbara had hoped that Virginia would marry. And it always rather amuses me to think that what Virginia did next, the fact that she hid Paul, her relationship with Paul, from her mother for the next 12 years or so, indicates that although she wasn't scared of the Gestapo or the German army or the Vichy French police, she was scared of her mum, and she wanted to keep Paul, but she didn't want her mother's wrath at doing so. They did eventually just decide to get married, by the way, and I'm very glad they did. If we could look at the next slide, that would be great. Thank you. And here they are in later life. So there you can see Paul. So he's shorter than her, he's younger than her, he's more junior than her. Oh, really quite extraordinary for a relationship at that time. But as her niece, who I spent marvelous hours with, told me, you know, he lightened her life. She had seen many horrors. She lost a lot of friends in the war. She lost a lot of people she'd recruited. She took that badly. You can't blame her. She felt responsible. And it was good that she had someone who would at least understand that. Goyo, as you can see on the just next to the door there, that was his name. As I said, he was French by background. Of course, now he has citizenship. And he was also necessary because after the war, she went to work for the CIA eventually, once it was formed, a bit of sort of the child of OSS, if you like. And I'm afraid to say that the CIA did not treat her well, as they now admit. They rather humiliated her, they sidelined her, they ignored her. They suggested she wasn't good under pressure. She couldn't cope with the crisis. This was a woman who'd been in the field and avoided the Gestapo for nearly, well, 3.5 years, who had dealt with all sorts of crises, who had never broken down, who'd never lost her cool or her ability to survive, no matter what was thrown at her. It was deeply depressing. Society changed, as we know, after the war. It retracted again. Women were supposed to go back into the home and become sort of model wives for the men coming back. But it was much more difficult for a woman coming back who'd been in the thick of some of the bloodiest fighting to deal with it, and particularly at the lack of respect given her. I remember spotting a note from E. Howard Hunt, you might know the name from Watergate, who in fact was a fan of Virginia's, one of the few who saw and despaired at the treatment that she was given, and talked about her being a sacred presence. But the fact was that she rather embarrassed them. There were a lot of college kids there who'd either not been in the war, had sat behind the desk. Very, very few, if any, had had her experience on the front line, and they didn't know what to do with her. So again, she became, I'm afraid, a woman of no importance, and retreated into this life at the house that they had outside DC now, where you see them in this picture, and where she finally died in 1980, in the 1980s, Paul dying a few years later. At that point, there were a few obituaries that people were a little bit interested in her, but they simply had no idea really what she'd done. And now finally the CIA's named a building after her. And I met a CIA trainer not long ago. He said that the first lecture he always gives to new recruits, he talks about Virginia and what she meant and her, what she did. In fact, it was someone at the CIA where I spent a day at Langley, extraordinary privilege it was to do so too. And they said that some of the techniques they use today are still based on what she pioneered, what she invented, really, back in the 1940s, when you're trying to set up networks in a hostile foreign country. And they pointed to Operation Jawbreaker in Afghanistan at the turn of the century as an example of Virginia's legacy. So she is just finally beginning to be recognized a little bit more. And I'm really pleased to say that, because I do find her inspiring. And I think a lot of people who read about her think, wow, you know, she really was an incredible woman. She wouldn't have wanted fuss. She didn't want glory. She just wanted respect. And thank you very much for listening to her story.
Thank you so much for such a riveting presentation. Wow, the visuals absolutely added to your wonderful storytelling. So thank you so much. We have gotten some questions. We have a few minutes to answer them. And audience members, just know you have a few minutes for your last minute questions. Our first question is, as an English citizen, what made you interested in an American spy?
Well, I have always been interested in intelligence. My own father was in that world for a while. And I am very interested in stories about women that we haven't heard about before. I think there's a lot in history actually that we still don't know about. So I was casting around through some of the books and papers on the SOE, and I saw Virginia's name coming up here and there, but never in much detail. But it would say something like she had a wooden leg, or she did this amazing thing, or she was an amazing woman. but it never went much further than that. A little bit here, a little bit there. And how could I not want to know more about how could a woman with a wooden leg do all these incredible things? Why don't we know more about her? Who was it that she worked with? Why did everyone think she was amazing, and yet no one seems to know about her now? And I find it even more amazing that an American woman didn't have to do any of this. For the first 6 months or so that she was in the field, America wasn't in the war yet. Pearl Harbor didn't happen. She did it not for any kind of idea of one country over another, but the idea that freedom and truth is worth protecting and fighting for wherever. So I find that idea that she did whatever she had to do extraordinary, and it just stayed with me, and it stays with me now.
Well, it's an absolutely brilliant story, so thrilling. The wartime scenes are just riveting, and we're getting some questions about a movie. I read that you have even written a screenplay for A Woman of No Importance. Is that true? Can you tell us a little bit about the a possible movie?
There is a possible things are going on right now, and I am sworn to secrecy. I'm not writing the screenplay. Someone else is, which is very exciting. A big name, three very big names are involved in it, and I'm hoping that there'll be news soon. But I also know that Hollywood works at its own pace and works in mysterious ways. So I can't promise you anything, but I'm keeping every digit crossed here. So watch this space. It would make a great movie or TV series, I think.
Absolutely, I agree. I think that having it as a TV series particularly would allow it to see all of the detail of her life, but anything we can get our hands on, we'd love. I have another question here, more of a specific question. Was Virginia Hall awarded a star at the CIA headquarters? I'm not sure what a star is, but maybe you know.
Do you mean in the lobby there when you go in? No, I don't think she was, but her portrait is hanging there in Langley. It's the first portrait, actually. Trying to think, you go to the back of the lobby, there's a long white marble corridor, and I think you turn right and there's a series of portraits and there's a huge painting of her there, and she's on her radio set transmitting, and the radio set is powered by a guy on a bike, sort of stationary bike, and that's keeping the radio set going. So that's there. They've also got some other artifacts to do with Virginia, but the main other kind of memorial to her there is the building named after her.
Well, they finally got their act together and are starting to speak her name into existence, which I think is so important. And my final question for you is, if Virginia Hall, other than the astounding legacy that she had, all the lives she saved, can you think of any cultural shifts that she made within the spy networks, opening the door for disabled women or women in general to take their place in spying in the world?
I think so. I think, I mean, it's interesting because if you read, as I did, the sort of the secret documents and the way that they talk about her. So these are the people back in London on her first mission. It's at the beginning, they don't think that she's going to survive. And then they become more and more astonished at what she is able to do. And then they start talking about, well, gosh, actually women are rather good at this, aren't they? So you realize that having started from a position where we were only sending her into France because no one else will do it, which is, she got a break because of their desperation. From that position, they then changed to, well, actually, look what women can do. But as I say, unfortunately, at the end of the war, a lot of those advances then went into reverse, just because society changed and people felt that they wanted this sort of, you know, the nuclear family, that they wanted women at home again. There were lots of large families and that kind of thing, and that's what people wanted. But for that brief time, certainly attitudes changed, and I'm sure that eventually, you know, that did have an effect, you know, on more recent times, that people look back and saw that a woman like Virginia, gosh, look what she did despite also being disabled.
And I think that your research and your publication is going to go really far in leveraging the existing efforts that Virginia Hall put in. And hopefully a lot of disabled people, women, all sorts of people read your book and feel inspired to follow in her footsteps. Sonia, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and for, you know, speaking with us tonight. I hope that you'll come back again if you write another book. I know you'll be very busy. So thank you again so much.
Thank you. Thanks again. Really good to talk tonight. Thank you. Goodbye now.
All right. Take care. And thank you everybody who attended tonight. All right.